Welcome to Marvel Vision, a podcast about Marvel, the MCU. And right now we're going to be talking about a big book, MCU, The Reign of Marvel Studios. I'm Alex.
I'm Pete.
And to talk about the book, we can't just talk about it on our own. We have two amazing guests for you, two of the three authors of the book, Joanna Robinson and Dave Gonzales. Joanna and Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Welcome.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hello.
I waved automatically. I'm just like,
That's
hey,
fine.
everybody.
The audio picks it up. The audio
Yeah,
picks
yeah,
it up.
Good.
Very
It's
special.
like smiling. I like it.
Yeah, exactly. People at home can feel that.
Yes. I love this book. For anybody who hasn't checked it out, it came out in October in hardback. Per the title, it charts the entire history of the MCU behind the scenes, includes copious quotes and interviews, behind the scenes info, and it's coming out in paperback as we're taping it. It's coming out tomorrow. Probably by the time you listen to this, it is out in stores, and it has an additional chapter dealing with the, I'm going to mispronounce this, but Annus Horribilis, is that the title of it?
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Marvel's not so great year, I guess we can say. But why don't we start on the more positive before we get into that and get into where the MCU is right now? I'd love to just logistically hear from you about putting together this book, because reading through it, obviously, you have a huge amount of background in journalism for anybody who doesn't know. You've written features, you've done copious, probably more podcasts than we've done at this point. But this is such a puzzle to put together in terms of all the different sources, all the different quotes, all the different history. So how did you first start to tackle this? How did this start to come together?
Yeah, okay, great question. Right, because we get the assignment, write a book about the MCU, and you go, but how? Should we organize it by movie? How far back should we go? How close to pub date do we want to get to? What's the end date? I remember at the beginning, Dave, this is still funny, like years later, Dave was like, we should do Blade to Blade. We should do the first Blade, and then they had already announced that Mahershala Ali
Blade
was
to
gonna play
Blade,
Blade.
I love
Blade to blade.
Like, let's do Blade to Blade. And as the book went on, we're like, oh, we're not gonna get the other Blade in time. It was like years and years that we were working on this book, and like the new Blade movie wasn't manifesting, so we had to figure out another end date. But yeah, we just started, I guess, way back to our book proposal. Dave, would you say we started just blocking out the sort of major points we wanted to hit in terms of the studio's approach to storytelling, or the technological advances we wanted to hit, or all these other things, and what movies best exemplified those moments in Marvel? So try to sort of weave together a loosely chronological, using various high points in the MCU franchise to highlight some of the innovations, some of the ways in which Marvel changed Hollywood, which is sort of the prompt of the book in the first place. Dave, what did I miss?
No, that was really good. We started as a oral history,
Yeah.
which meant that we would have to tell the story almost completely just by the people we had interviewing it. So our subjects that we outlined for the oral history were slightly different and slightly tied to each film, because that's sort of the production circle that you would, be talking to lots of writers and then talking to lots of people who designed the Hulk and that sort of thing. And we were building on that. At some point, though, Marvel kind of started exercising their NDAs, especially with visual effects companies, which makes sense now in hindsight, because they were working on, the early Disney Plus shows and stuff like that, and they didn't want, Joanna and I to accidentally get them to spill the beans or something. But we had to, some point, stop with our Disney sanctioned interviews and start working around some of the roadblocks they threw up in front of us. And when that happened, we changed from a oral history to more traditional history. And I think that ended up really benefiting the book, because Joanna and I were working on it, just the two of us, for a while. And then we brought on Gavin Edwards, our third author, when it became a not oral history, because he's written like 13 books, an amazing Samuel L. Jackson one that I read before, and then just like an amazing Bill Murray one. He's got a real rhythm to telling a story. So then it became Joanna and I would assemble all of these facts, and we would try to group chapters a little bit more thematically. So we allowed ourselves to jump throughout the timeline if we were talking about certain developments, to sort of build some of these bigger arcs. So in the book, we have a pretty gigantic arc about who's trying to control each movie. And so we're always trying to figure out whether it's like Marvel Studios in Hollywood or the creative committee on the East Coast, and how much fan expectations plays into that. And so we tried to just center every chapter on not only telling an interesting story, but basing it around who's in control in that time and what stories come out of that battle for control.
Yeah.
One thing just wondering, because if I was kind of tasked with something this awesome and this epic and also so close to my heart as a comic book fan, were you guys like scared to find out, get behind the scenes about like how the sausage is made, and were you worried about your fandom at all, getting involved in something like this?
Oh, I was
Like,
just talking.
oh, go ahead.
I was just talking to my brother yesterday how nice it is to not be like that little shit from Latino Review who thinks he knows something and now be like a co-author of a book. So like at first I was like, finally I get to prove some of my stuff right, was how my initial thought was like, I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna prove World War Hulk was on the
Yeah.
table since 2012.
Yeah.
And I never quite got there, even though there were occasionally quotes where Joanna would do an interview and I'd throw back a quote. I'd be like, they got so close. They got so close to saying Planet Hulk, World War Hulk. Let's do it. But what I eventually learned is it was so much more interesting than how I had been approaching it. So from a fandom standpoint, things like plot, things like spoilers, what's going to happen next, what are the big cheer moments, those all became really interesting. When it became about how did Marvel Studios happen, a lot of legal deals became extremely interesting to me. A lot of like Mark Ruffalo is told, Comic-Con's tomorrow. If there's a limo outside your house in the morning, then you've got the part of Hulk, but otherwise it's just sort of like wake up and look out the window. There are all these sort of like tinier stories that ended up grabbing my interest to the point where the part of me that really wanted to be right, the true answer is they've thought of everything. Every hour that we spend thinking about it, somebody inside Marvel or Disney is also thinking about it.
Yeah.
So were those things true? Probably. I think we found more interesting things than I thought we were going to find just by digging into the human business stories that ended up sparking up around this, because we all enjoy the movies, I think. It's sort of the behind the scenes process about how this happened and how this might not be able to ever happen again, sort of up for debate, that the book really gets into.
The other thing is, like, I've known Dave for a really long time, and he has changed the way that I think about not only story but also marketing. So Dave was just like always on the lookout for, what are they hiding from us in this Marvel trailer? What have they edited out? He's like, Hulk isn't even there in that shot from like Infinity War. I know it. Like all this sort of stuff. And so we have always sort of been slightly skeptical when approaching these kinds of things, but it doesn't change the way that I love them. In fact, I think it makes it better because you're loving it with your eyes entirely open rather than, fearing that you're going to be blindsided by some horrible story. I'm like, okay, now I know the whole messy thing, and I still really love this massive story that they told us over decades of filmmaking. And so, yeah, I don't know. That's how I love to love a thing. So.
I mean, I think that really comes through in the book, honestly, when you're reading it, because you're pretty upfront about the fact that you like these movies and you like these TV shows, and I think it's the introduction. But there's also a critical eye at the same time throughout to some of the more troubling parts, or some of the more troubling collaborators, like, shy away from what Joss Whedon did or what other folks did in real life that are pretty upsetting things while still trying to tell the story in the middle. Do you think, is that the sort of thing, if Marvel had been more collaborative, would that have been impeded at all? Is that the sort of thing they would have pulled back on, and perhaps having them be like, no, we're not, gave you the freedom to go in that direction?
I think so. Like, Marvel put out its own sort of coffee table book of its first 10 years, written by some journalists that I like and admire, but in exchange for the access they received, there is this expectation of, you're going to tell the good stories, and we all want to like hear the good stories. Like, we're all interested in that. There's a lot of great information in that book. We really like it. We cite it in our book. But they can't, if it's just given the stamp of approval by Disney, tell the whole story. And so, yeah, I think we were able to. I mean, I would like to think, Dave, that we would have told as much of the story as we could get purchase on anyway. But I think there was never this negotiation. It was always just like, okay, we're just going to tell every single thing that we learn to the best of our ability, as long as we can get it corroborated by a number of people. And it feels like it is definitely true. We want to put it in the book, and stuff like Joss. That's a complicated thing. I'm like the world's number one Buffy Vampire Slayer fan. Like I love the stories that Joss has created, but I think it's important for us as fans to think about who these people are and how some of their messaging might have seeped into the stories that we love to relish. And so just to always be thinking about, again, today's point, who's in control? Who's telling the story? What has Marvel East Coast said about who can be a hero, and how has that impacted how long we had to wait for a Black Panther movie or this, that, or the other thing? Thinking about those people and their fingers on the scale of storytelling was like a really interesting thing for us to do. How about you, Dave? Oh,
Oh
sorry.
yeah. Oh no, no. I think if there was a time period right when we realized that Disney sort of wasn't cooperating with us anymore, and that was going to shut us out to part of Marvel, where we could have made the decision to be like, let's try to make a deal with them, let's talk to them, and we decided not, and to try to report around it. And I think ultimately that's great. We did, I think, lose out on some stories that like maybe the Disney adults are going to be really into, like, Disney archives or cool things that
Mhm.
maybe we would have gotten a look at if they had been more into us. But luckily, by the time that wall had gone up, like Joanna had already been in Kevin Feige's office talking to him for like several hours. So we had a lot of our like good stuff and felt like we could move forward. And everybody already knew what we had and everybody knew what we were looking at. And it's their right to try to stop us, and it's our right to figure out the truth. So I think it ended up working out really well.
I just wanted to mention, I just pictured in my head, Joanna, tell me if this is how it happened. The wall going up in Kevin Feige's office. Did he get the call and then he hit a button and it was like,
And then I was just dropped down a chute and
Yeah.
tumbled out somewhere in Burbank. Yeah.
not to turn it back to more serious things and not to spend too much time on this, but I did think this really pointed to how well you hit this structurally throughout. To get back to the Joss Whedon thing for a second, you put it up front. And I was just curious when you were putting together the book, what the discussions were behind the scenes, because you talk about his abuses, you talk about everything that he did over the course of a page. And then that's followed by getting into the Avengers, getting into him essentially being the shepherd of phase two and beyond. So was it not much of a discussion, or was it a discussion to be like, we got to get this up front, we got to get ahead of this in terms of the reader's mind?
I think yeah, we didn't want anyone for a single second to think we weren't going to talk about it, so it's best
Mhm.
to talk about it right at the jump. And yeah, I think as you're putting especially a book, this is the first time Dave and I have written a book, co-written a book. Thinking about someone reading a long story from you, you always have to be thinking about trying not to lose them because they are going to misunderstand a phrase or a chapter or a page or whatever it is. So, Gavin did so much work. His style is so good, like stringing everything together, but we poured over every single sentence. And there were three different, what I love about doing this is three co-authors. There are three different set of eyeballs from three different people who have three different experiences in terms of the thing that might offend or baffle or whatever them, and we could just say like, hey, I think this wording might make people think this, or I think this wording might make people mislead people and make them think that we don't care about this. And so I think checking that from each other, I think, was really important as we went through the editing process.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the Whedon, I'm sorry, with the Vittoria Alonso stuff at the end, I think is something that we really got in a way that because of the time that we were there and the people we were talking to, I don't think anybody else is ever going to have that full perspective on the story because we're pre-NDA active lawsuit while we were writing it. So everybody was allowed to talk, and now nobody's allowed to say anything. So we got something like that. And that was great because that felt like it was our story, like we were building there. We could have ended with like, and now Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantum Mania was the most brilliant visual effects thing ever, and Victoria Alonso's on top of the world. That's not how it worked out, and Joanna was able to report it out, I think, very accurately. Also, like, yeah, putting out this book and Jonathan Majors is still on trial is just sort of like I hope we said the right things. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
those were much more different than something like Joss Whedon, which we needed to say some things, but a lot of his very specific and very ugly allegations are not on that production, and therefore kind of weren't our story. We wanted to acknowledge it because it's true and it's part of history, but it wasn't like necessarily us. someone like Scarlett Johansson has nothing but good things to say about Joss Whedon's Avengers script, so we just used that because we, did that. Whether or not the critics feel like that's a full Black Widow character is ultimately not about Joss Whedon or the production. So trying to make those decisions, but I am very happy with where we ended up, especially with the Victoria Alonso stuff, because I think that was part of our story to tell, especially how she was elevated with Marvel Studios.
And that was really late breaking for us in sort of again, we've never written a book before. You have to turn in your manuscript for the book, and then there's like, I don't know, what is it, 8 months until it comes out on shelves.
9 months.
Like,
it's a full baby. It's a full baby.
I was just like in
Doing
this
the full baby.
year space of like, what's gonna happen? There's gonna be something major that's gonna happen that's not gonna be covered in the book, and we're gonna look so dumb because we didn't address this, that, or the other thing. And thankfully, I think we did have at least, acknowledgments towards what was happening with Jonathan Majors, and then we were able to report out the Victoria Alonso story again very late. That was like we had to take the manuscript back from the publishers and get it in. We had to go back through the whole book and say, hey, when have we mentioned in Victoria before, and how can we sort of seed some things that there's trouble brewing here way back at the beginning of the book so that it won't feel like it comes out of nowhere, sort of slapped in at the end of the book. And so that was part of the whole book writing process.
And we couldn't change the page count, so if we had to add something, we had to take it away from something else. It was a real mess.
Sorry. Another thing that happened is like we started this book in 2019, off the heels of Endgame. Like Marvel couldn't have been bigger ever in its existence, and it was supposed to be this sort of like celebratory look at this amazing company and what it's done. And then movie after movie after movie, people were like losing their faith in Marvel. And so one of the major things that we changed pretty late was the title of the book, because it was going to be called The Rise of Marvel Studios. And I was just sort of like, I'm not sure that's the tone that we want to hit when this book comes out. And so we changed. We didn't want to say The Rise and Fall of Marvel Studios, because I think it's too soon to say The Rise and Fall of Marvel Studios. We're in the middle. We're seeing what's happening. So we settled on the reign of Marvel Studios. Just be like, this happened. They ruled Hollywood for a decade. That happened. What happens next? We're not sure. But let's make it less like this company's on the up and up and up and up and up, and there's nothing standing in its way, So
yeah. Well, my mind's kind of blown because there were so many great ideas thrown around here. But one thing I want to kind of go back to that you mentioned is this unique idea of having three different perspectives. And sometimes when you do have three different perspectives, it's hard to pick, what gets in or where kind of the story goes. Like, my mind is still reeling from the Blade to Blade, where the nerd in me would be like, oh my God, I've always wanted just to talk about Blade movies this whole time. And then I would have to fight with two other people about why that isn't good. Like, journalistically, so you have your journal side of you and then your nerd side of you. Who wins those fights? And then how do you kind of like decide? Because nerds are very passionate. You're going to tell a story of something we all just kind of lived. Like, how do you kind of pick what juicy stories get in and what we haven't heard 80 times? And like, I would love to hear some nerd fights behind the scenes and like who won and how that was all kind of decided, because 3 is an odd number if we're voting here.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I mean, I think so. We're, we have different perspectives, but are all, Gavin's a bit older than us and Dave's a bit younger than me, but we are all like sort of relatively close in age. Gavin does have the perspective of like someone who was reading the comics before Dave and I were reading the comics. So that is like a sort of a historical thing. I have the perspective of someone who was never as deep into the comics as those guys were, but was like deeper into filmmaking. But Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but it felt like a constant, because we're all friendly. Dave and I have been friends forever. Gavin sort of folded.
There were some tough pandemic days where you and I were trying to get something started. And I think like one of my first notes to you, and I regret this now because I just didn't suffer, it was like, thanks, I hate it. And it was just like,
oh, wow.
It happens. It happens.
Yeah. We had to figure out what our initial foothold was going to be, and then also developing our book voice. Also, Gavin helped with that, but Joanna, you and I had to work with that individually, because like I'm super scrappy confrontational, and Joanna works for Vanity Fair, and Gavin writes books, and so we have to kind of boil all those together into a soup that tastes good for everyone. But ultimately, I think towards the end we can talk about some specifics. I definitely do want to talk about Joanna trying to write a Marvel versus DC chapter on COVID.
On COVID. I got thrown out of the book. So
Yeah.
Oh man, that sounds amazing.
A lot of it would just kind of come down to this needs to be a book for everyone. It needs to be a book for those Marvel fans that have read everything. It needs to be a book for people who don't even like Marvel movies, but maybe like Hollywood. So we wanted to have a little bit of everything. We didn't want to spend too much time talking about the plot of Infinity War, and we also didn't want to spend too much time talking about how great the Thanos motion capture is, but we did want to kind of touch on all of those things to put them in the sauce. But yeah, I specifically remember there is several thousand words about why the Marvel Fortnite crossover in 2020 was really important, because it was like a year without Marvel, but you could play Fortnite, and I certainly did. And I got way into it, and we got to the part, and Gavin's like, do we need this? Is this part of Marvel Studios? And I'm like, no. And so it all just went away.
But at the same time, like Dave, of the three of us, Dave, who works in animation, is part of the many jobs that he has, is always interested in the VFX side of things, is always interested in digital innovation. So there's a lot of that stuff that is, of course, of interest to people, is of course part of the Marvel story. But the way that I viewed it is it was a lot of give and take, where it's just sort of like, okay, Dave is going to want us to talk about this, this aspect of motion capture dust for this sort of thing or whatever it is. And I'm going to want to make sure in among the Joss Whedon is problematic parts, we also have these various people talking about what an impact narratively he has had on pop culture. Like that's something that's important to me. Or like the chapters, certain chapters about representation are important to me. Not that they're not important to all three of us, but like, I might want to talk about the way women have been treated in the MCU a bit more than Dave and Gavin. And then Gavin had certain things that were important to him. So at the end of the day, were there fights? Yes. Am I sad about that DC chapter getting cut? Not that sad at the end of the day. I just wish I hadn't spent like a feverish day or two on COVID writing it. But it felt like a gift we were all giving each other at the end of the day, of like that you want this part of the story told. Okay, how important? What is your battle that you're picking here? Do you need to fight for this one, or are you going to fight for this one over here? So
this may be too loaded of a question, but between the three of you, including Gavin, who is the Feige, who's the Desposito, and who's the Alonso?
Oh.
That's
I
interesting.
think
I'd say, yeah. No, you could. No, please, you go first.
I think I'm Louis Desposito. That's what I think I am. What would you say?
Oh, the reaction to Dave! That's
Did
awesome.
you disagree?
You're absolutely the Feige. Are you kidding?
Oh, okay.
If there's somebody representing this book with the MCU reign of Marvel Studios ball cap on, it's Joanna Robinson. I would say Gavin's the Feige. He's the one that I think he might be the only one of the three of us who didn't miss like a word count deadline. He was in like Peru and writing, but he'd still be like, "Here are my pages," and Joanna and I sometimes would be like, "We got really close." And I would. I
think Gavin's the Feige.
Okay.
Gavin's the Feige. I'm Louis Desposito in terms of like smoothing things around for various people, and then you're the scrappy one who gets fired. I think that's
at least we agree on the scrappy one who gets fired. That's definitely my position.
You stick to your principles, and then you get fired, and that sounds right to me for Dave. So yeah.
Talk about a specific plot thread in the book, which I was pretty surprised by. Like I knew about this, but the amount of time you spent really drove it home for me. David Maisel is a much more important figure to the development of the MCU and Marvel Studios than, frankly, I really knew before reading this book. I'd love to hear you just talk about that a little bit for anybody who hasn't read it, to sort of sell them, I guess, on that first part there and why he's important.
No, definitely me. Yes, I went through a lot of the initial release of this book, calling what I said like is the David Maisel appreciation tour, because he is, hopefully not anymore. MCU Reign of Marvel Studios gets the story right, but at least when we started this, there was a lot of back and forth, at least in the press, because Avi Arad wanted to have a piece of the pie really early on in the MCU. He definitely was there at his inception. He definitely is a big part about why Marvel exists at all. But he would, like give interviews to like the Hollywood Reporter, send emails to Latino Review, being like, "You got the story wrong. I was responsible for all of this." And as you research more and more Avi Arad, you realize he's a fabulist, and that's also what makes him a great type of business person. But you need to really nail down the who's and the what's and the try to get a second source on because you can't single source Avi Arad as much as you would like to. So luckily, Joanna got in contact with David doing her piece on Vanity Fair, and David was very gracious with his time to give us like several interviews, but more importantly, to explain to people like Joanna and I, who have some smarts but are not lawyers, the amazing deals he was able to make that allowed Marvel Studios to be built. He essentially got financing from Merrill Lynch Bank without putting anything up as collateral except the movie rights to like Captain America and Shang-Chi, these things that were not considered valuable properties at the time. And it's getting $530 something million for nothing. It's actually amazing once you realize the scope of it. And then just to have the wherewithal as a producer, we hear stories in Hollywood all the time about producers with too strong of a hand, just to be like, whatever Kevin's doing over there, he seems to have a handle on it, and just by letting him do it. And David Maisel went really quickly from producing Iron Man. It's a hit. He gets Iron Man 2 in the books and immediately walks over to Bob Iger and is like, "I hear you might be interested in a little sale." So it's just wins all the way down for David Maisel. And just because he exited as president of Marvel Studio earlier than everybody else doesn't mean he doesn't deserve like so much credit for being the person who seemingly willed it into existence, because he literally just was like, "I want to meet with Ike Perlmutter and tell him he can make his own movies." And I managed to make that happen. So
It was,
absolutely amazing.
yeah,
Very interesting dude.
very interesting dude. It was also somewhat irresistible that part of his origin story with Marvel takes place at Mar-a-Lago. And so I remember, like, I think way back to the book proposal, my favorite chapter title was Once Upon a Time at Mar-a-Lago, which wound up in the final book, but like got cut at one point because, to your point about negotiations, Gavin at one point we said every chapter should start with a Marvel movie quote, and Dave and I were kind of like, okay. And instead that would be the chapter title. And then eventually our publisher's like, that's going to be a nightmare table of contents. You can't do that. So we have the movie quote is there, but we also got to bring the chapter titles back in. I was like, yes, Once Upon a Time Mar-a-Lago is back on the table. I'm so excited. So yeah, I just think that David's story, because it's not like a sexy story, it's like a loopholes in contracts kind of story. We tried to make it understandable, digestible, and as exciting as it actually was. I mean, they're running through the streets of New York at one point, like there's a lot of excitement, but when you compare it to what antics did Robert Downey Jr. get up like to here or there or the other, you might be tempted to cut it, but it's so integral to the whole story. So.
I mean, I think it's also important in terms of reporting, not to throw anybody under the bus, but like Stan Lee built up this myth around him, as I'm sure you're well aware, but just for our listeners, in terms of like, I woke up one day and suddenly the Marvel universe, and that's like kind of what we're told, but that's 100% not true in any capacity whatsoever. Yeah. Obviously very important, but not the sole progenitor there. And I think there is this myth that's built outside about Kevin Feige that way, that one day he put on a baseball cap, a light appeared above his head, and it was like, MCU, here we go. Yeah. This, I think, provides an important document in terms of working against that narrative, a little bit at least.
Yeah, and again, we love to like the thing about David Maisel, which I love, is that he's frustrated a bit that his story got kind of swallowed by this larger myth, but he never once in all of the interviews we had with him, sort of setting the record straight, ever tried to take any credit away from Kevin, because he's like, it's not about not celebrating what Kevin has done. Kevin has done incredible things, but it's about that's not the whole story. And again, that was our hope for this book.
I hired Kevin for that president position, he would say.
Exactly. He's like, but then he did great things, you know. And so it's not about knocking anyone down, but it's just, you know, it's not about knocking, first of all, incredible Stan Lee impression. It's not about like it's not about
Don't
trying
encourage
to
him, please. Do not encourage him.
Excelsior!
it's not about tearing down Stan Lee, but it's about sort of, okay, this is what Stan Lee actually did, which is amazing, but he didn't do everything. This is what Kevin did, and it was amazing, but he didn't do everything. Avi Arad did only 10% of the things that he has claimed that he has done. So, you know, it's just all interesting personalities.
Well,
Another. Oh, go ahead, Pete, please.
I was going to say, speaking of interesting personalities, one thing I was happy to hear about, and Joanna, you said this in another interview, that you know, you got to spend time with Kevin Feige, and he's great. You worry about like, oh, what's it going to be like to hang out with somebody and spend some time with somebody, and then you had a hot take that if he wasn't a ginger, Marvel wouldn't be where it is. Could you explain that a little bit?
Did I say that in an interview?
You did, yeah. And
I could believe that. Kevin Feige not going to prom because he wants to go see Back to the Future 2 again. That's it.
Correct.
That's I've been raised a ginger move. I have ginger relatives. I could say that.
I love a ginger. I'm pro ginger personally. No, I mean the thing about Kevin Feige, which is wild, is like, you know, to go back to this idea of like Dave and I have quite cynical roots. Dave working for Latino Review or me working at Vanity Fair for many years, we hear so many stories from different sources to be sure, but we hear so many stories. It has ruined so many people. Someone will be like, "Oh my God, so and so's my favorite actor," and I just bite my tongue because I've heard so many bad stories about that person. It's just sort of like it really does abolish the idea of hero worship when you work too closely in this industry. There's just so many stories about people. Feige's like a bizarre exception. Like I just don't hear, like we've heard there are people who are pissed at him because of things that happened, you know, with their trajectory at Marvel, or there's like tiny handful of stories about him getting a little mildly salty, but still low sodium compared to like everyone else in Hollywood. He's just a kind guy, but he's also political. Like I think the thing about Kevin, you can't get that high without being political in Hollywood. So like, is he a kind, good guy? I think he is. But has he also made it a very strong policy to not make enemies of people? Yes, he doesn't burn a single bridge. He makes sure that even as, you know, Avi Arad leaves or whatever it is, he doesn't talk shit about them, with one exception being Edward Norton, you know, like and even that again is fairly low sodium. So like he doesn't burn bridges. He's just sort of like, everyone likes Kevin, and that's to his advantage in the business world. But also I don't think he's faking it necessarily. So it's impressive.
One of the big narratives that comes out over the course of the book, and not to, I guess, spoil things that happen in the real world for anybody listening, but is you can kind of feel like the clamps coming down over the course of the book, going from the filming of the first Iron Man, which you describe as this very loose, freewheeling, improvisational thing, drinking behind the scenes, to as they start adding more and more people and departments. There's a pretty quick turn there. Maybe I'm getting the timing wrong, but even from phase 1 to phase 2, where it seems like a lot of the movies are being created before the directors and writers even get on board. Where do you think that turn is? And I know there's a lot of discussion about this externally. Do you think that's for the better, the worse, or just sort of 50-50 in the middle?
It's hard to say because ultimately Marvel Studios is the only people I think that cracked this formula, even if it doesn't work perfectly. It's like, you know, DCEU failed. I haven't checked in on Disney's Descendants interconnected universe in a while, but I don't think it's as big as the Avengers. So
Rise of Red? You didn't watch Rise? Okay.
Is that also about gingers? Rise of Red?
Yes, it is. She's extremely
great.
ginger.
Okay, great.
The mask.
But yeah, they sort of left them alone for Iron Man because it was sort of like a prove yourself, let's see what you can do. And the character, it's like to Marvel Entertainment was just a toy, so there was really no way they could mess up Iron Man. And then Iron Man and Hulk were sort of in dual production, and they both tried this. What if we hire an A-list actor and give him a whole bunch of control? They have one that really worked out for them. They have one that didn't work out for them. So that's the information that they have. But all of a sudden, with the success of Iron Man, Marvel East Coast is like, oh, maybe we should get a little bit more involved. And just by that process, you have to start laying some stuff out. You have to connect Thor. You have to come up with theories big week to interconnect the movies, and all that stuff leading up to Avengers. So they assigned Jeremy Latcham to like make a timeline, to make a work with the people doing various screenplays, and sort of make that phase one timeline. I think it's after the Avengers where they're like, it helped us in phase one to allow a director that gave us a very successful movie a whole bunch of control. So they brought in Joss to sort of like help them align phase two. And Kevin Feige, excellent businessman. Joss Whedon, less good at that. By the time he had like signed on to do the thing, he had already basically told his siblings they could do a Agent Coulson show, and Kevin Feige's like, he's dead, and we're stopping Shield next year. I don't know what you're doing. And Joss Whedon's like, no, it's fine, and you gave me this deal that allows me to create this sort of like side thing. And so that's not only like sort of the beginning of the conflict between Feige and Whedon, but sort of like the reason phase two kind of flies off the rails is there's this huge battle for control between Whedon, Marvel Studios led by Feige, and Marvel East Coast and the creative committee, all trying to be like, we know how to do this best. And the result is Age of Ultron. And everyone's like, well, we all failed.
No.
So what happens? But
yeah,
go ahead. No. It's most of the way through.
I would just say that there's a part of me, the part that loves independent cinema, that loves, talking about like let artists be artists, all this sort of stuff like that. Like, I wish I could look at the MCU and say every time they let a director completely control their film, it was a success. So they should just let people do that. The artistic side of me wants that to be the case. We can't make that claim wholeheartedly. We can say in certain instances, like giving Ryan Coogler more control over Black Panther than they did, let's say Anna and Ryan on Captain Marvel, like I would say that Black Panther is going to stand the test of time as this triumph, and Captain Marvel, a movie I quite like, but like is not going to be the crown, the jewel in the crown of Marvel. And so I do object to the notion that Marvel is sort of paint by numbers. They do all the previs, they do everything, and the directors they're just there to handle the actors. I think in the perfect ideal circumstance, it's of course some sort of middle ground. And I think what we saw, especially in the machine that was Joe and Anthony Russo, and then Marcus and McFeely, their screenwriters that came with them in a lot of their projects, and like all of that is a machine in a way, but it is also the Russos as directors and Marcus McFeely as storytellers having given more leeway than some of these sort of one-off writers and directors have enjoyed. But like Chloe Zhao, an artist that I quite admire, Eternals, a movie I do not like. So, it's just like it's a really tricky balance, and sometimes Marvel absolutely knocks it out of the park, and sometimes they overcorrect in one direction or another.
Yeah. Well, jumping ahead to the final chapter of the book to talk about Marvel's bad year, this is something, again, you've added on for the paperback version. It doesn't quite get up to the present, of course. We've already talked about the timeline there.
Yes.
But it gets close.
You should have seen the text message thread with the Doom announcement, just being like, fuck. That's so close.
Just write it in. Go to every bookstore, write it in.
Just say Robert Downey Jr. is Doom. Well,
on the back page.
Yeah.
I guess actually maybe even jumping ahead of that then, where's your take on where Marvel is right now? I know that's like literally all of the pop culture conversation all the time, but I'd love to just hear from you guys in terms of how you're feeling about it.
Okay, here's what I'll say. I feel kind of smug right now because there was like, when we were doing the major book tour for the hardcover, the narrative at that time was Marvel's cooked. Marvel's over. The second Captain Marvel film came out, and that, the narrative around that box office, and everyone's just sort of like, Marvel, it's failing, it's failing, it's failing, it's failing. And Dave was always very insistent until a movie that has Avengers in front of a colon fails, then Marvel is not failed. And what we were also saying is I was like, Deadpool and Wolverine's going to make a gajillion dollars. Like we know that that's going to make a gajillion dollars. People are going to like it. That's just we knew that that was true. I was really hopeful that Agatha was going to be good, and as I told you guys before we started recording, I am loving Agatha. People are liking Agatha, despite there is like that sort of the shitty certain corner of the fandom response, but overall that is considered a popular, successful Disney Plus show right now. And so you've got, barring the Echo binge drop that they just sort of swept under the rug at the beginning of the year, that's a successful Marvel year, is it not? Like the huge box office success of Deadpool and Wolverine, the kind of slightly more artistic success of Agatha, which is still like mainstream, but also is getting the attention of people who are like Catherine Hahn, Aubrey Plaza, love her. And so if they, as they have stated, slow down and really drill down on making sure to produce less but make sure that each thing is worthy of the Marvel logo in front of it, I think they have a really bright future in front of them. I am worried about the Captain America film from everything that I've heard. I do not think that that is going to be a huge success, but I do think Thunderbolts is going to be good, and I do think Fantastic Four is going to be good. And so I think that, like, especially with Thunderbolts and Fantastic Four being like this sort of post slowdown project, like I think that's when everything we've been seeing has been part of what they were working on before they really realized that they were in crisis. But I think starting with Thunderbolts and into Fantastic Four and into everything after that is a Marvel more aware that they can't just do anything they want and people are going to line up for it. What do you think, Dave?
I mean, yeah, I'm with you. I think you could call all of this year a success for Marvel, because even though Echo didn't hit maybe as big as they wanted to, it was incredibly cheap and is an example of what Marvel is saying they're going to do, which is taking something they're not super confident in and fixing it, which has always been, they say they could do it in post-production. Now we've seen like bunch of reshoots. I don't even know, with something like Ironheart that I think has been in the can for at least a year, like
yeah.
how that's going to end up being.
Correct.
But I do think, mostly co-siding what Joanna says, what we are looking for here to say that it's over is a movie with Avengers in the title bombs. And I think Marvel knows this, which is why it's called Thunderbolts Asterisk and not whatever new Avengers team they are, actually, which we'll be calling that movie a year from now for forever. But they're being really smart with it. I think they accelerated a lot of the nostalgia plays that they were planning to do, maybe save for more towards like the Secret Wars thing. As soon as No Way Home started doing well, they're like, well, if we could do that, let's bump this up,
Yeah.
especially with things like the X-Men, because before Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, the idea was the X-Men were really, really far off. It's like they're down there, don't worry about it. We don't even have time to talk about them. And suddenly we're in trouble, and so we break the Hugh Jackman glass in case of emergency and bring the X-Men back. So they already did that. I was expecting them to hold out a little bit more. But then coming back to the team, sort of like to jump back 2 questions ago, what Joanna was saying, how like there's this idea that there's like this Marvel machine and then directors sort of get added onto it. There was an additional machine on top of that, and that was the Russo, McFeely, Robert Downey Jr. team. And so they've paid millions of dollars to bring that team back, and we're going to see if they could recapture the magic. And, I hope. But that being said, if it's bad, if those are the Avengers movies that bombed, like what a fantastic, at that point, 40 movie run. I'm never going to be mad at it. As a Spider-Man fan in the mid-90s, I'm like, none of these things are ever going to be on a movie. And right now, somewhere in the world, Nick Cage is playing Ben Reilly, Spider-Man Noir, and I'm like the happiest little Clone Wars gentleman.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Go
So
on.
like, Marvel's still bright future for me. Does it have to be making $1 billion every movie? No, I don't think that's sustainable for anything. But they've been successful enough that at least probably through my lifetime, I'm going to get to see cool comic book stories from Marvel. So I'm excited about that.
And you're getting next November, Blade is coming out, so you can finally finish the book.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's definitely
We'll see.
coming out.
Definitely
this
I
coming
bought
November.
tickets. I bought tickets already.
yeah,
I'm in the theater.
yeah,
I'm
for
excited.
sure.
Dave, if you could take anything away from this interview, it's Blade to Blade is $1 million idea. And please
Thank you.
don't
Thank
give up
you.
on it, please.
I agree. If Blade had come out, that's what the story would have been, Blade to Blade. But
Let's make it. I mean, it did really make me feel great that he was in Deadpool and Wolverine. And I was like,
Oh,
we could have just done Blade to the same Blade.
Yeah.
If we-
Snipe to snipe. I love it.
Oh,
yeah.
I will say, just to tee you up before we let you go, you are working on a new project, which is much easier, much simpler, less of a thorn bush. Harry Potter for your next book.
Oh my gosh!
What
you guys-
what can you tell us about that? Because, or if anything, at this point, I don't know where it is in the process.
The middle. We're in the middle, right, Dave?
Yeah.
Middle Earth, would you say?
I'll say what's
Wrong
super
franchise.
exciting about this
I
versus
know,
like
but
the MCU.
Call back to the
is-
poster behind her.
Oh, okay.
Joanna was saying how like, yeah, we wrote most of this under like the rise of the MCU, and people kept being like, well, we want to change the title, and we eventually did Reign. I am super interested in how many different types of fandom and culture that Harry Potter touches that has had both a rapid expansion and then a rapid contraction. Just like, how does a franchise IP move forward knowing that it needs to serve its fans, knowing that it needs to serve a book series, knowing that it needs to serve a movie studio, knowing at this point that it needs to serve theme parks that are canonically involved in the actual story. I think there's a lot of interesting things, not only about business and storytelling, that we didn't get to touch, but I think we kind of left off the fandom angle to Marvel. I think I was really close to it, but also because Marvel doesn't really listen to fans as much as people might hope or think. And so it really was
So
sort of like
true.
a next step process. Harry Potter, you get to bring that extra piece of the pie in. It's that it's had an active fandom for a very, very long time. Original internet fandom that is now aged. And so how does all that sort of fall into the mix?
That's the story of Harry Potter, which is so interesting, is that like it's a story that shaped a generation and will go on, but like the millennials specifically like are so shaped by Harry Potter as a story. It's a story that the story of Harry Potter is the story of the rise of the internet and online fandom cultures and the way in which those happened in conjunction with each other. The story of Harry Potter is the story of the rise of fan fiction, is the story of the rise of conventions in a more targeted way, all of that sort of stuff. And like with
Merchandising.
merchandising, yeah.
Like-
Merchandising.
Merchandising. People are buying like little plastic
Spaceballs
wands for
with
like
flamethrowers.
$25. It's kind
Yeah.
of genius that what they've been able to do with that.
And so I think similar to MCU was like our story of what has happened to Hollywood in the last 10 years that like touches on like where did the mid-level movie go and all this sort of stuff like that is inside the story of Marvel. There's another storytelling story inside of Harry Potter in terms of like how fan ownership of story has changed the way that we think about these storytellers. And so when you have someone like J.K. Rowling and then you have something like the Harry Potter fandom, and how are they interacting as the fans are growing up and J.K. Rowling's opinions on things are changing and all of that. And sort of to go back to Dave's idea of control, Marvel in control, Potter in control, Warner Brothers, who's in control here? Like what's going on with this giant IP and what will happen when the TV show comes out? That's all sort of on our mind as we're putting this together. So.
I mean, not to stick on this because this is a Marvel podcast, but I'm curious, have you, given that Marvel gave you like a no, and we talked about the wall going up and everything, I have to imagine there's a even thicker wall going on with Harry Potter.
We shall see. TBD.
Fair enough. Before we let you go, then, anything else you want to plug? I know you have a ludicrous amount of podcasts, but anything you want to mention?
Dave does a podcast called Fighting the War Room that I absolutely love and I think people should listen to. And
Joanna does a podcast called House of R that covers lots of different pop culture with Mallory Rubin. Is one of my favorite podcasts of all time.
And together we do a podcast called Trial by Content. And the next couple weeks we're going to be covering witch movies. So that's kind of...
Also, I bet Joker 2 would be the biggest movie of the year, and obviously it's doing what it's doing. So,
Dude, what?
I believed you. You were
Dave, you were my guy this whole time, Dave. I was...
No. Not
Lady
as big
Gaga
as, like,
billion-dollar movie sequel in January sounded like a great thing. We didn't even know the budget in January. I was like, this is gonna be anyway. So listen to Trial by Content to watch me spiral into madness as the year goes on. And Terrifier 3, unrated, no ad campaigns nationally. Terrifier 3 beats my best movie of the year.
Clown versus clown. Clown versus clown. Thank you both so much for coming on. Congratulations on the book. It's fantastic. Everybody should check it out in paperback tomorrow, today, whenever you're listening to it. There you go. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for having us.
And if you'd like to support this podcast and all the podcasts, we do patreon.com/comic book club. Also, we do a live show every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. to Facebook and YouTube. Come hang out. We would love to chat with you about Marvel and the MCU. Apple, Spotify, Android, or the app of your choice to subscribe, listen, and follow the show. At Comic Book Live on Twitter/X, Comic Book Club Live on TikTok and Instagram, comicbookclublive.com. For this podcast and many more, until next time, stay marvelous.
Oh, stop pushing it with your impressions. I knew this was going to go this way.
Blade, blade, baby, blade, blade.